Okay, great. So again, I'm Fatima. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am executive director of Muslim Justice League. Many of you have maybe heard me speak on this issue already at the many rallies and events, city meetings that have been going on. And we really wanted to make sure to have a space like this where we can share more analysis and understanding of what is happening. I think some of you have probably attended some of the various city meetings about this issue, as in city-led, city-held meetings. There was one in a weirdly dark auditorium, and then there were two special council meetings on it, one of which just wrapped up this afternoon. And we know, many of you who attended those meetings felt extremely frustrated. And I think community members who are impacted by this have felt really frustrated by both the lack of answers from the city on how they take someone's life, and their framing and their messaging on why they did something like this, right, or why this happened. And we know that's really heavy to process. It's heavy to listen to. Many of us have to do this to be able to do this work. We have to listen to them and understand what they're saying so we can figure out how to respond. But that can be really tough for all of us to process. So we really wanted to have a space where we can share, some of what they're saying and give some context around it, and also share what we know and some of the things that they're not telling you or showing you, that we think are really important. I also want to share, there was the second part of the special city council meeting this afternoon, and a few of us were watching. I personally had to miss a good chunk of it to be in conversation with people around the country, people in Los Angeles and Atlanta and Raleigh and Memphis, who are dealing with a number of police killings. It has been a really difficult start to the year, I think, for so many of us, right? From Keenan Anderson to Tortuguita to, just countless folks. I think Daryl Williams and Raleigh. There's so many of us dealing with this in this moment. And I know, for MJL and our partner organizations that we do this every day, this is the kind of work we're dedicated to. And, we rely on connecting with folks, not just around Boston and Massachusetts, but across the country, to understand what can we do, right, in these really difficult and dark moments when a life is stolen from the community, is stolen from their family, right? And there's two things to be thinking about there that I want to share as our general approach to this, as an organization, again, dedicated to this kind of work every day. So one part of that is supporting the family. And from day one, some of you may have heard me say this, like, that's our first responsibility, is to support them. And that looks like giving them space and giving them care and love and allowing them to actually grieve, right? I can't imagine, what it would be like to actually go through this, right? I hate to think about it, and I do think about it sometimes, right? You don't know, like, that something like this is coming, right? And it's so overwhelming. And I really am going to keep urging people to keep that in mind, because sometimes, you know, other folks want to, rush to do things, right? We have so much urgency around this. We're so upset. And we also know that this is actually a slow and steady fight that we have to do. We know that these types of cases take often years for families, and they are going to need our support when this is not flashy and it's not in the news, right? They're going to need our support with a lot of things that are behind the scenes. So we really have to be thinking about how are we actually going to support them in the long run. And a big part of that is really building a strategy around this, because again, I think it's easy to respond in the moment to what the city is saying or what we think is urgent or what is necessary, without taking a few moments, to check in again with people who have been doing this work for a long time about what is strategic, what is going to help their case in the long run, right? What is going to get us to any kind of justice for this family? And then the second part of this is the systemic organizing that has been happening for so long and that many folks on here have probably been a part of. Even before 2020, right, when many more people, started to catch on to some of this. And that again takes, thinking about what can we get done in that bigger, longer vision that we have for justice and freedom, right? And again, not just responding in this very moment, but taking the time to strategize with each other. So we hope that some of what we're sharing today will help all of us be able to do that, be able to understand what are these terms that people are even throwing out here. What are some of these devices and weapons that Cambridge police have? Why are they talking about this in the ways that they're talking about it, right? So that we can be strategic and build our power around this. So the first thing I really want to talk about, and I'm going to go over, the first section around the Cambridge police and how they responded to someone who needed and deserved help. And then our friends Katie and Atara are going to talk about what the district attorney and her role will look like in this, and her track record around this, because this isn't the first time that someone in Middlesex County has been, killed by police. So we'll touch on the district attorney, and then we'll come back to the city of Cambridge, which also has, such a big role to play here. And you've maybe heard me say this before, but I'll say it again. All of these people are responsible, right? From Cambridge City Council to the city manager, to the police department, to the district attorney. There's so many levels of responsibility here. And so we need to understand, how and when to go after these different folks and who's responsible for what. So I think, one of the most uncomfortable things that we've seen, and that so many people from the Bengali community, from the Cambridge community, his friends, his family, have felt really viscerally, is the way the Cambridge Police Department is framing Arif as a threat. Arif is how many of his friends refer to him, who we're in touch with. So that's, often how I'm referring to him. We've seen this, in the city council meetings, especially. And I know some people have been saying, why don't we have the police report yet? And, why aren't we seeing that official police report? But we actually kind of know from what the commissioner said in these meetings how they are framing it and the types of language that they're going to use in this. We also know how the media has framed him. I think some of his own teachers said, people were glossing over the headlines because it was framed in a way to make him sound really violent, right? And then deep in the story, you find out this is a 20-year-old person who was in distress, who was hurting himself. And the person who called for help likely thought they were calling, people who could actually help him. So even though, the commissioner, I think in the first special meeting said, they chased him, they tried to engage him multiple times. They tried to de-escalate, supposedly, right? And then framed him as a threat to everyone nearby. She said something to the effect of, there were other people around and a daycare nearby. And so he was now a threat to all of these people. I'm going to break down what we know of how the police actually responded and how they turn this into more violence, right? How they responded to someone who was hurting himself, and then they hurt that person. They made it so much worse, right? What was the point of them responding if they weren't going to de-escalate and actually help him, right? So what we know is that they had at least 12 officers, from what we understand, in a number of cop cars arrive on scene. I'm still unclear if there were EMTs on scene as well, since 911 was called, and if they were just not allowed to, go near him and engage, or if they were not on scene. But the commissioner said, I think, around 12 different officers, right? All with weapons, uniforms, a number of, police cars arrived. For those of us who live in neighborhoods that are over policed, like I do, even the sight of a police car and the sirens and the lights is an escalation, right? You feel some anxiety probably when you see them arrive. So imagine you are in one of your worst moments and 12 different officers. And then we know that a number of them, I think 4 or 5, I'm not entirely clear, chased him for at least 5 blocks around his neighborhood. So imagine that you are chased by strangers who are, likely yelling at you, who, again, uniformed, so on. There's people staring, and how much worse that is going to feel. And I know this is heavy to walk through, but I think it's really important to understand what they did in this situation to this person. That is what they called trying to engage him, right? Chasing him, probably, yelling at him in some way or speaking to him in some way. They chase him. And then in their official statement, and a few times they've said they tried to de-escalate by shooting a sponge round. I think they have always called it a sponge round. I want to be clear that this is a large sponge-tipped bullet or sponge-tipped grenade. Sponge round makes it sound like a soft, fluffy thing, right? And I'm going to show you all what that actually looks like. I'm going to show you a diagram of it and a video of someone using it on a wood panel, not on a person, but still pretty, a bit intense to watch. So this is the diagram of what this looks like. It comes into like a mini sort of grenade launcher. And you can see here in the top left, the diagram of the sponge round itself, right? So it has a sponge nose or sponge tip, and then some combination of a plastic and or aluminum case. It looks like a big bullet. It's quite big around, and it shoots at, I think, about 40 miles per hour out of this thing. It's also important to know where this comes from. This is something that was developed in Israel to be used on Palestinians, who are a people who face this every day. These quote unquote less lethal weapons, which are still weapons, and they're called less lethal because they're still lethal in many cases. They're also still extremely violent. They're quite painful. So you're going to see now what that looks like when it's just used on a wood panel. And imagine, again, that this is shot at you as a person. So this person, I think, is using ones that have chalk on them. So you'll be able to see like a few different ones that are shot out, right? So I don't know how they can call this de-escalation. And we have to be really thoughtful about how we respond to this kind of language. So you'll see paused for everyone, or if it's playing. Here we go. So he's gonna walk over and you'll be able to see, he's standing from quite far away. I'm not sure how far away they were from Arif. I'm also not sure if it actually hit him. They didn't say clearly if it hit him. So you'll see the holes that this punched through the wood panel from quite far away. So again, this is not a de-escalation. This is a violent weapon. As Palestinians know, and many people who face, daily repression and militarized violence, these less lethal weapons are used to take people's eyes out, right? To actually maim people and hurt people. And that's often intentional. So when we think about this, when we talk about less lethal weapons, I think it's very easy for us to respond and say, why didn't they shoot him differently? Or why didn't they use a taser or something else? And we've just had 2 different people around the country die from the use of tasers by police. So we have to think bigger, right? We have to think beyond some of our, immediate reactions to this. I think we can stop sharing the screen if that's okay. We have to think beyond that, right? What we don't need is less lethal weapons, right? This person deserved support and care, right? I want to call out that, in terms of that sponge grenade, something that was, developed to be used on Palestinians. I have to say the Cambridge City Council does not have a good track record on supporting Palestinians, as many of you know, if you advocated to them in the past few years on that. And it's not shocking to me that a city, near MIT and near so many weapons manufacturers would have, all of, so much access to other, again, quote unquote, less lethal weapons. So we've seen people respond to this and say, well, Couldn't they have a social worker with them? Couldn't they have, a different kind of response with the police there? But we have to name that the police are a violent response. So many of us in our day-to-day lives often respond to our own community members in these moments of crisis and know how to de-escalate, right? Many of us actually practice this. Sometimes it seems like this really far-fetched vision, but I actually know so many of us do this day to day. And then we're also trying to build up these alternatives, right? So we actually have to think about, what do people need in these different moments, right? Not how do we change this police department to be quote unquote better, but what do people actually need? Start from scratch, start from a blank slate. Because the other thing that you're hearing is like the Cambridge Police Department, they used all of their protocols. They did everything by the book. They keep saying this, that they're one of the best in the nation. And this is what that results in. This is what the best progressive police department in the country gets you. It's still violence, right? We know that from their day-to-day harassment of unhoused people in Cambridge, right? It's not just this moment, right? There is so much violence enacted by this police department day to day. And this is what it gets you. Throwing more technology at them, more equipment at them, is not the response that's needed. We have to think about, how are we actually going to take away their violent response, and how are we going to build real care and wellness, right? And supportive responses. So you've heard community members say, he deserved help, not bullets, right? And I think that's like a phrase to keep in mind, right? What does it look like to actually help someone? And how are we going to take these bullets, whether it's a sponge-tipped round or the armored tank or the many rifles that they have, how are we going to take these things away from the Cambridge Police Department? I'm going to pause there and hand it over to Katie and Atara to talk a bit about the district attorney. And I may have forgotten some of the things I was supposed to say. If I did, I'm so sorry, Hussein, but I'll be back later with more after Katie and Atara.
Hey everyone, this is Atara speaking. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also a resident of Cambridge. I've lived here for a long time. One of the things that, thank you all, first of all, for spending your evening learning and talking and listening with us. I have a bit of a cold, so forgive me. Katie and I are going to go over what an inquest is and some of the experience that the Middlesex DA has with inquests. So one of the things that we continually keep hearing from the city manager and the city council and the police commissioner and the DA herself, if you were in that first meeting at the elementary school, was to let the process play out so that we can have accountability and find justice. And those are both in heavy air quotes. And the mechanism by which they are giving those things is this inquest process, and then potentially the idea of a criminal prosecution. And so we wanted to go over what that means, what that looks like, and how long it can take. Just so as we're crafting that sort of long-term organizing agenda or organizing thoughts that Fatima was talking about, we are using the language that they are using, and we understand what they mean when they talk about it. I personally don't think all of them really understand what this process is. And so part of this is also like a skill up of like, let's understand what this process is. And then we can evaluate for ourselves whether it's going to bring justice or bring accountability or bring any amount of satisfaction. The process that is happening now is called an inquest process. It's called an inquest. And an inquest is a very formal legal way of saying a fact-finding mission. It is a judicially run fact-finding mission. It means that a judge is appointed from the Massachusetts judiciary to find out what happened here. And they are answering only two questions. They're answering, did a death occur, and was it the result of a crime? And so there's no, the resolution of an inquest is an opinion of a judge about whether a crime occurred that caused someone's death. Normally, this kind of fact-finding mission is something that the DA would be doing, right? So normally, if someone brings to the district attorney the idea that a crime occurred or behavior occurred that could be considered a crime, the DA does that fact-finding mission, and they use the local police as their investigatory body. That's how it structurally works. In this situation, there is a gatekeeping that is being asked for, where the DA is not doing the investigation themselves and not using the local police necessarily, and instead a judge is doing a fact-finding mission. And it takes a really long time, like 9 months to a year, for the judge to do this fact-finding mission. And they're only answering those two questions. And there are some important things to know about what this fact-finding mission looks like. First off, the public is not invited and not allowed, right? It's overseen by a judge and it's a closed process. And the judge controls the whole investigatory process. It's closed to the public, but anybody who's under investigation is involved and allowed to be there with their attorney or their representation. And the family of the person killed is also allowed to be present and may participate as the court permits. It's also important to note, because this isn't a normal judicial proceeding, any of the rules of the way court is supposed to work also don't apply. So the kind of evidence you can hear, what is generally permitted in a courtroom, those don't apply here. And the judge can investigate whatever the judge thinks is relevant. They can also investigate in the community. They don't have to stay in the courtroom. They're empowered to do whatever they think is right in order to go through this investigation. And it can take as long as they think it needs to take. At the conclusion of the inquest, the judge is required to issue a detailed written finding. This is a report that basically includes all of their investigation and answers the question, did a death occur, and was it the result of criminal behavior? And that's all it does. The report has to include the name of the person who died, the name of the person whose unlawful act or a negligent act contributed to the death, and all the circumstances surrounding the death. And it just stands on its own. It's not in and of itself a criminal prosecution, and the district attorney is not beholden to it, right? So once this report is written, the DA gets a copy of it, and only the DA gets a copy of it, and they can decide what to do. They're basically making they're deciding between two choices. Are they going to file criminal charges and pursue a criminal case, or are they going to decline to do so? And only once they tell the court what their choice is, then it becomes public, and all the accompanying documentation becomes public. So it's important to note that the process that is happening now is a precursor to any kind of criminal prosecution, and can take as long as it can take. Katie's going to talk a little bit about the experience with this DA's office, but it can take 9 months, it can take a year. It will definitely take an amount of time that this DA's office and anyone doing the investigation thinks will calm the waters. Katie just put in the chat some facts about the inquest, sort of what it is and how it works. And it is also a process that does not have to be relied on, right? So it's important to note that this DA is deciding to rely on it, but they're also under no obligation to do so. And that this DA's office is not unique. This is a Massachusetts statute that is that any district attorney in Massachusetts can take advantage of. And also many municipalities and many states around the country have this same process for police shootings and police killings. And so Cambridge definitely likes to think of itself as being unique and at the cutting edge of things. And we like to understand how that isn't the case. And that this is a process that many places use to investigate police shootings. I'm going to stop there and kick it over to you, Katie, to talk about what this DA's office's experience with this process is.
Hi, folks. As Tara said, I'm Katie, and I'm also a Cambridge resident. And as you might have guessed from the way that Tara is speaking about the law, we are also both attorneys, but we're really here tonight as community members. But if people have more detailed legal questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or in the Q&A as we're going through this. So before I pivot to specifically this DA's office's track record, I want to give one little additional piece of framing, which is that this is a process of inquiry that is framed as a fact-finding that's in search of the truth, but is really, as Atara said, about searching for legal culpability. And so the question that they have to answer is a narrow question of whether criminal conduct happened here. And in particular, it's important to note that the standards that govern police use of force are very different than the standards that would govern the use of force by any other member of the community, right? That the law is set up, it's structured to allow use of force by the police that no other person is allowed to use, and that police officers are judged in their use of force based on what a reasonable police officer in the totality of the circumstances of that situation would have done. So I say that only to emphasize that the law, even after the reform that happened in 2020, is structured to give cover to the police in the decisions that they make, and that the appearance of impartiality of having a judge oversee this process, which is why the district attorney's office has selected this process.
It still doesn't disrupt the underlying structures of power that are written into the law that make it very hard to seek through the law accountability for police misconduct, and also any kind of redress that would be meaningful to families that are impacted by this kind of violence. And I know if folks were listening earlier to the city council meeting, there was some discussion about what are the governing standards on use of force in Massachusetts and what are the governing standards of use of force by police in the city of Cambridge. So I'm just going to drop in a couple of additional links if people want to read those on their own. Among the changes that I believe were made in 2020, the Municipal Police Training Committee specifies that the police are not entitled to use deadly force if a person is judged to be only a threat to themselves, which is not written into the Cambridge guidelines to the same extent. But as we all have heard, and as Fatima made clear at the top of the hour, the city narrative has already been that their view was that the officer decided that this person was a threat to them, right? That Arif was a threat, despite the fact that it was a call about offering care to somebody in medical distress. So pivoting now to the way that this office has approached this kind of inquiry. So since 2018, the Middlesex District Attorney's Office has been using inquests for fatal police shootings. Any other kind of police violence still goes through a process where the district attorney's office is the investigating agency, even though the DA's office also relies on that same department in its everyday work of prosecuting cases, right? So in part, the reason that they have moved to the inquest process, I think, is because of that apparent conflict of interest, and also to ensure impartiality, again, as we said before, or at least the appearance of impartiality in the process of reviewing what happened. There have been 14 investigations or inquests of police shootings since 2013 in the Middlesex DA's office. And you can read all of the prior reports and the additional materials on the DA's office website here, if you want to poke through to see what these investigations have looked like in the past. And again, as Atara said, this process could take anywhere from 9 months to a year or more. But the kind of top line takeaway is that in none of the investigations that the DA's office did itself, did they find any criminal wrongdoing by any of the officers involved. And in one of the fatal police inquests that have happened since 2018, I believe there have been 3 of them, a judge at the inquest found that there was probable cause to charge a homicide offense. And the officer was then ultimately indicted for manslaughter, which is an unintentional killing that still is criminal. And ultimately, that officer, after a jury trial, was acquitted of any wrongdoing. So to the extent that this process is being framed as a way to, 1, find the truth, or 2, assure accountability, I think what we're trying to convey by going through these facts is that this is not a community-led process that is interested in thinking about how to prevent this kind of death from ever happening again. It's a very narrow legal process, and it has not really delivered closure to the families that have been affected by this kind of police violence. I'm happy to pause there. I can share the additional links about the ultimate indictment and then acquittal in that particular case that we mentioned, but I'm happy to take questions at the end.
I also wanted to add to Katie what you said so well, was how long, at least that last case, the one where at the inquest process did suggest criminal activity, took from the shooting to the ultimate acquittal, which I think was 4 years. And so 4 years from someone's family member being shot and killed by police to ultimately an acquittal, and then that police officer being reinstated back on the force. The facts of these cases are not super dissimilar from, the little that we know about Arif's case, which I think is also instructive. Not to just help us understand what it is these processes are for, and how narrowly they provide any kind of resolution or understanding of what might have happened. They're adversarial processes to find some kind of legal culpability for a killing, and we have given police the legal authority to kill. And so therefore their defenses are not difficult. And because they have legal authority to kill, and they are called to answer all sorts of problems, when they do kill, this is what is most likely to happen, right? And this is not to say that this isn't something that someone should want, or that this isn't something that a family member might not, like a family might feel empowered through this process and might feel like this is something that a road that they might want to go down. But I also think it's important for us to understand what it is we can expect here. And when we are fighting for something different, which is for this to not happen again, what's the usefulness of this process for that? Right? And so what's the usefulness of a very individualized adversarial system focused on whether a police officer did something that they shouldn't have done to ensuring this doesn't happen again? When at its best, it's not like there's no punishment that usually ends up happening. And I'll just sort of leave it at that and kick it, Fatima, back to you, but also at the end, if there are any other questions about it, Katie and I are happy to answer.
Yeah, and just one more brief comment I don't know if we made clear is that even though the district attorney's office has officially handed this off to a judicial process, they also maintain involvement throughout that process. So that there is an ADA, an assistant district attorney who works under DA Marion Ryan, who is present usually during the process. It's not just the officer and Arif's family that get to participate. The DA is also involved in the background and able to ask questions of witnesses in order to facilitate their own review within the confines of this process. So it isn't an entirely independent process. I think there is kind of this veneer of impartiality, but they are also still actively involved throughout the duration of the inquest.
Thanks, Atara and Katie. I am going to unspotlight you and spotlight myself. I'll add to that, since we've had questions about this and have been supporting community members on this. There's been, we know that the Cambridge police have knocked on the doors of people connected to him who were not there when on the day of this incident, to be questioned. And there was a good amount of rightful outrage about that, and questions about why is his life leading up to this being investigated instead of the life of the officer who actually shot him. And also, how could the Cambridge police be involved in this investigation, right? They're now saying, oh, the Cambridge police are only identifying people who will then be questioned by the state police. But just a reminder that we do not recommend ever talking to the police without an attorney. Reach out if you need an attorney if they show up at your door. And we have videos and resources online about what to do when any kind of law enforcement show up at your door. I will, go back to the city of Cambridge. So we started by talking about Cambridge Police Department. We talked about the district attorney, which is the county level. And now going back to the city of Cambridge, and I will cover the thing that I forgot to share earlier when I was talking about, the types of violence that the Cambridge Police Department uses, right? This very progressive, top-notch, quote unquote, community policing oriented department, because so many people have said, well, why don't they have tasers? Why don't they have body cameras? Why don't they have these things? Rather than focusing on that, we should look at what they actually have. Saying, if you can pull it up on screen, they actually have this inventory, and you can see here a number of different types of rifles and guns. And this is not all of them, I think, that the Cambridge Police Department has. And in fact, in the special city council meeting, Councillor Quentin Zondervan pulled from the archives that the Cambridge Police Department has only shot at people 5 times in 80 years. I'm not sure how in the world that justifies, this supposedly very peaceful police department having all of these weapons and more all of the time, and an armored tank. So I hope that we can talk about, the incredibly violent, and militarized police department that exists, that I think is not always visible to folks. What this connects to is how, the city of Cambridge is framing this issue. It's important to know, and I've had to explain this to so many people, unfortunately, that Cambridge has this really weird, undemocratic form of government, first of all. So if you're not a Cambridge resident, or even if you are and you didn't know why this exists, Cambridge has this thing called the city manager, right? So Cambridge elects their city councilors. The councilors decide to hire someone called a city manager, who really has a lot of the power that typically a mayor has. If you're in the city of Boston, for example, or many other cities, that city manager actually has so much of the power and functions of the mayor, even though they're not elected. So people may have seen this in the first city meeting. It was actually not Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui who was on stage the whole evening answering questions, right? It was the city manager and the police commissioner. So it's important to understand, the roles of these various players and the city council, how they interact. And then Cambridge has this thing called a peace commissioner, and his name is Brian Corr. I will call out something that was said in this special meeting today. You know, they were very defensive of Brian Corr. And someone said it's not like he's skulking around, you know, doing this kind of job. And I will say, literally at the mosque, you know, just 2 days after Arif was killed, when we had to show up and have conversations with people about what was going on, he was in fact skulking around, having side conversations with leadership at the mosque about, you know, where to put their rage and frustration, and not to necessarily focus on the city. So there are these roles that feel and sound very Orwellian, right? Peace commissioner. And I think a lot of people felt a lot of frustration in that meeting that he facilitated, where he called us friends many times. I think some of us who live in Boston can feel quite a vast difference between how Cambridge politicians are framing and messaging these issues, but then they're still saying some pretty ridiculous and terrible things behind all the friends and the soft voices and the, you know, telling us to take space and make space, but then they're actually painting us as a threat. In fact, their response to not, you know, people wanting the officer's name to be released was, you know, they're really concerned by the tone of the community organizers, right? The tone of the protests. They're concerned about his safety, not ours, not the person who was actually killed, right? They're concerned about his safety because we're somehow the scary ones, when we're the ones who are demanding a world where someone's life isn't taken, right? Where someone actually gets the support that they need. We're demanding, you know, healing and care and safety for everyone. But we're being painted as a threat. And I think another city councilor was saying, oh, you know, people in the community who are supportive of the police feel scared of even coming to these meetings because of the tone and the rhetoric, right? It's just infuriating, right? That is how they see us, right? And I know that for a fact because at the first rally in front of City Hall, you know, the Monday after he was killed, probably many of you were there, you may have seen the live stream. You know, we as MJL, we organized safety marshals, we had we had legal observers there. We had so many volunteers out there to try to keep each other safe, right? Because we know we have to rely on each other. And our volunteers pointed out at least 2 undercover police officers, right? Plainclothes police officers in the crowd, you know, carrying guns on them, right? Which can be even more terrifying than a uniformed officer, because if you see that they are carrying guns and you don't know who they are, right? In a community of predominantly Black and brown folks showing up, right? That's a scary thing. So our folks pointed that out. And it was just confirmed in the special meeting today. Councillor Zondervan asked them, you know, what is this true? And, you know, what was the point, right? Why would you choose in this moment when people already feel so unsafe to then send undercover cops? And I know, you know, many of you reach out to MJL for support on this kind of thing day to day. When your protests, when you're organizing is surveilled by local police departments, state police, by the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the BRIC, right? So I want to remind folks to know that that is likely happening at all of these events, right? Whether they're uniformed or not, because they see us as a threat. And that is why they respond to community members in crisis in this way, right? Like day to day, this is how they see us, right? This is how people think of us. Even when we're in mourning, when we're grieving, right? When we're trying to share space with each other and trying to heal and trying to demand justice for someone whose life was taken, we are seen as a threat. All of the soft tones and the fluffy language that Cambridge politicians are using can't obscure that, right? If you hear what they're saying at the core of it, they're so concerned about us. They couldn't even have the meeting in person today, right? They moved to do it virtual. They wouldn't even let people go past 2 minutes in the public testimony in the meeting last week. Which again, I will say as a Boston resident, they let us go over time all the time, right? People are getting cut off at 2 minutes about the death of a 20-year-old in their community, right? No sense of what people actually need. And that was felt at that first city meeting as well, right? They're like, oh, we got to move on to the next question, friends. We got to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. But it was so clear they were only holding that meeting to cover their asses, right? To make it seem like they wanted to hear what we had to say. And then when we actually said it, they couldn't handle it, right? They had no real responses. So I think this, is a reminder of how, city council itself, the city manager, everyone involved in Cambridge government is also responsible for this framing. Day to day, this is how they work through this, right? This is how they think about us. And they haven't moved, right? They can call themselves so progressive, so liberal, right? So advanced. But we know by what just happened and by the actual policies and those 10 kinds of rifles that I just showed you, and the money that is poured into Cambridge, which I think the Cambridge Police Department has over $70 million budget, and Somerville Police Department has like $13 or $15 million budget. Cambridge is not that much bigger than Somerville, by the way. So we know that's not the reality. And if you feel like tearing your hair out while you hear the way that they speak in these meetings, just know that I'm with you. I'm really like, this is one of the most ridiculous parts of this is we're trying to have a real conversation about what happened, and they're obscuring it with this language and continuing to paint community members as a threat. So I haven't been looking at the chat, so I don't know if questions have come in yet. So maybe we'll check with Hussein and see, I think between me, Atara, Katie, we have been unfortunately listening to everything the city has been saying, and also doing a lot of research and talking to other folks. So we do hope we can, answer questions if folks have them.
I don't think I see any questions yet, but there are a lot of great comments in the chat. People reflecting on how Cambridge does feel like it's a lot about tone policing, a lot about respectability politics, and kind of the ineffectiveness of Cambridge police in trying to portray that they're community police, but they're really not. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I made a lot of comments about the Boston versus Cambridge and Somerville divide over many years, and many in the past few weeks, because I know you know, one of the first things a politician said to me around this was like, oh, but I think, you know, Cambridge has better policies than Boston. And I said, no, you don't actually. You know, if you had looked at any of our materials that we, you know, have pushed that can be used in all of the cities, and we often support, you know, the local organizing of like Defund Somerville and many other local groups, including the Black Response and Heart in Cambridge, you know, they would know that actually, you know, they haven't advanced the kinds of policies that other folks have been talking about. So when we talk about alternatives for Cambridge, you know, I know mental health is coming up a lot, and that is really important. And there's so many things that police do that they shouldn't do and do not need to do. Traffic is one of them that, you know, folks in Boston have been talking about a lot. And that includes, you know, construction details, right? When construction is happening on the street, but also just actual, like, you know, day-to-day kind of traffic enforcement. I don't know if we have the link to this to share right now, and I can try to dig it up in a second. But again, you know, we know that there's so many unhoused folks in Cambridge and Central Square, especially, who get harassed day to day, right? And who often people call the police on folks who are not in distress and not like looking for any kind of intervention. And our friends at Material Aid and Advocacy Program have this really awesome, powerful report from their unhoused community members about how they are policed. And I think it's just important for everyone to read that. Arif, in fact, worked at the CVS in Central Square, and I'm sure, you know, saw this kind of thing, you know, day to day. So we have to be able to think about, again, what do people actually need in a lot of different responses or in different situations? Not what do the police currently do and how are we going to make them less terrible? I don't care about making them less terrible, right? It's enough. Like that, we can't lose people and keep asking that same question. And that's the thing about body cameras, right? The entire point of body cameras is we know they do violent things, and so we want to catch it on camera. I'm much, much more interested in stopping them from doing those things, not giving them, you know, more equipment, more funding. Oh yeah, thanks, Katie, for putting in the map report.
We actually have some great questions. So there's two that I see right now. Oh, another one just popped in. I'll start with the first two. One, what can we do to help if we live outside of Cambridge? And then two, has there been any community investigation that has uncovered more facts that would counter this police narrative? These cases are largely decided by political pressure and not relying on the government to investigate itself.
Do y'all want to take the investigation question first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit about this, and that in fact there's a long tradition, a Black radical tradition in particular, of doing not only community investigation but also like community public trials, right? And there was one such case in Boston where in the 70s, and I'll put links to this in the chat after I finish speaking, where again there was like the formal investigation provided no answers to the community and no accountability, and so a community organizing response hung 10,000 posters all over the city with the officer's picture on it and said basically like this officer killed a member of our community, and then held a public trial where they put on their own evidence and kind of did that as a rallying cry and also as an opportunity to have their own form of kind of closure around the treatment of not only in that individual instance, but also kind of the broader patterns of policing and how they had affected Boston's Black communities. So I think in part, there's a bigger strategic question of what are the goals of a process, right? And I think there's obviously a tremendous amount of interest here in knowing what happened, and also a lot of interest in the community response and preventing anything like this from ever happening again, right? And those might lead to different organizing responses. And so part of the question of what could a community investigation look like, you know, is in part ties back to those, what are your goals of such an investigation? Is it about, or some kind of community public trial, right? Which is a possible tack that you know, groups have done before.
I wanted to add and just sort of talk a little bit about answer some of the questions. I think part of the cover of an inquest process is to push off publicly announcing any information. And so everyone has heard the DA and the city manager and the police commissioner and everyone on the city council saying, let the process play out, because none of the information that's being asked for in here will be submitted to the public as a matter of policy and also law at this point, right? So once it goes to an inquest process, that process by law is not open to the public, which means now the city and the police department and the city manager have legal cover and not policy cover to be able to say that they're not going to release the name of the police officer or any of the parts of the investigation until the inquest process actually plays out. So part of the purpose of an inquest process and to rely on it is also to give legal cover to not releasing any information to the public. And so I think that should answer some of the questions on like, why don't we know the name? Why don't we know more of what happened and how Arif was killed and what the circumstances of all of that were? And we won't now know until that inquest process is finished, submitted to the DA's office, and the DA makes a decision, which is a terrible answer, but also is the answer of the law here, right? And so that I think is mine and Katie's like most important thing to put forward, right? Which is that this is what the law says is okay. And it isn't to cape for it, just to sort of understand what it says. And what kind of cover the city council can now take, which is like, we are not allowed to tell you, rather than it's our policy not to tell you, which are magnitudes of difference.
Yeah, I can add the first thing I did, and I knew the response, but I did a request for the police report, and I knew they would say it's under investigation, you can't have it, right? So everything connected to this, they're going to say is under investigation, and you know, use that and use public records exemptions around that to, you know, not release anything. But like I mentioned earlier, we get the preview of it, right, in these city meetings. I've told people, you know, even without that official police report out, you know, we just heard the commissioner last week in the first special meeting, you know, frame what happened, right, and call him a threat to the nearby daycare and nearby community members, right? So we know how they're talking about it, and there's so much we can do, like Katie is saying, to take control of the narrative, right? Like that's what community organizing looks like. We don't have to always rely on their messaging and their tools, right? We can say, well, this is what actually happened, like we're doing tonight, right? I thought it was very important for us to actually have this conversation, start sharing back with you all, because we're just researching the hell out of all of this, right? Like we are looking up everything we can around this. I'll say to the question about, you know, what can you do if you're not in Cambridge? One important reminder is that he, you know, lived in Cambridge at that time, but went to Somerville High School, did a lot of youth programming in Somerville, went to UMass Boston, right? Like there's the technical boundaries of these places, and of course, you know, we're all kind of one area over here, right? So I think it's important for everyone locally to be thinking about this and to be naming, yeah, how are you going to push systemic policies in Somerville, in Boston, in Lynn, and Newton, and Cambridge, and all of these places. And we know a lot of folks who are doing that. So if you're looking to get plugged in and you don't know what orgs are doing that in your city, we can help you, you know, find those folks. Again, we often as MJL focus on Boston because it is so big, and then that has a big impact on the other cities. So you can always use our tools to say, oh, well, Fatima said Boston shouldn't have ShotSpotter. I wonder if my city has ShotSpotter. So highly encourage folks to be thinking about what can you do on systemic organizing in your city, and then uplifting Arif, right? I think it's been so difficult for his loved ones to see how the media and now the city is painting him as a threat, right? The kind of gross language that they use. And what's been powerful in response to that is showing pictures of him living his life, right? When he was a kid, when he was part of the Mystic Mural Project. Go check out the mural. He's literally in the mural. He was part of it, and he's kayaking in the mural, right? So uplift his life, right? You know, uplift his story, and make sure that people know that this is happening, and it is connected to Keenan Anderson and everyone, you know, around the country who has been killed by police, right? That they all deserved so much more than what, you know, what's happened to them. For one of these questions, I'm actually going to call on the audience because I think that I know the answer about if Cambridge police have received counterterrorism training, particularly from Israel. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. But I know there's some folks in the audience like Ragini, maybe Leah's still on, who might, and Heike, maybe some other folks who might actually be able to answer that. I don't think you guys can unmute necessarily, but maybe folks can answer in the chat if it hasn't been answered yet.
I can answer that.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yes, the answer is yes. The commissioner of Cambridge, several commissioners ago, and I cannot remember the name of the commissioner, it was a man, went to Israel on one of the trips funded by the Anti-Defamation League. And was, you know, there have been trips like this with many of the Massachusetts area police commissioners. The Boston police commissioners have gone, not the current ones, of course, and these trips were suspended to a certain degree after a very active campaign that was designed to expose the trips. I think that Hussein put in a link in the chat that goes to something called Palestine is Here, which is a website that identifies all of the police training trips that have taken place around the country, and it's a very easy to use website. But it is quite conceivable that the Anti-Defamation League, despite its claims to be re-examining the question of whether or not they're going to be promoting and resuming police training in Israel. I forgot the beginning of my sentence. Anyway, they might resume.
Yeah, I can add to that too. you know, when we've looked at the police departments that have gone to Israel or engaged in these kind of counterterrorism trainings and, you know, essentially learned worst practices, right? Um, it's often the local university police departments who have done that as well. So I want to name, when I say Cambridge Police Department has this large budget, that's just their police department. I actually don't know the budget and size of the MIT Police Department and the Harvard Police Department. We've often supported the folks doing, you know, prison divestment and abolitionist organizing at Harvard. And I think it's important to call out that, yeah, Cambridge has, you know, 3 pretty significant, you know, police departments together. And then also like actual, you know, weapons manufactured, like, you know, these big, awful tech companies. As someone who came from tech, happy to like call them out all of the time. I will say to questions about the autopsy, um, you know, I'm kind of wary of answering those questions, even though I know some of those answers, because again, I think there's a tendency for folks to want to like get into some of these details that the family is dealing with, and we have to make sure that they have the right support to figure that out, and also not have a ton of people telling them, oh, you should do this, you should do that. I do know, you know, like the incident happened on a Wednesday. It's very important for Muslims to actually, you know, bury our loved ones like very quickly, right? And that couldn't happen until a few days later on Saturday because of the autopsy and medical examiner process. And then, you know, the janazah happened on, like, I think it was Saturday afternoon after the incident. But yeah, you know, they are currently represented, the family is currently represented by Barbara Dugan at CARE Massachusetts, who's a close partner of ours, and we're working so closely with them to figure out, you know, how do we make sure the family is okay, and also to get them the best support for every step of this process, right? Because like Katie and Atara said, like this can take a very long time, and that's so draining for families, right? Like I think it was assigned to a Judge Coffey in Lowell. The inquest was actually already assigned to this judge. And so Barb and I were just talking about, you know, we're going to need to make sure they have transportation, right, to Lowell. Like there's so many unglamorous things that we can, you know, figure out to support them through this, in addition to dealing with all these like really complicated and difficult, you know, questions. So there will be so much more to come. And I think I would just encourage people to be patient and give them the space to deal with that, you know, like I think I've shared this a little bit publicly, like and the DA had said this in the first city meeting, like they haven't met with the DA yet. That's not because the DA hasn't been trying necessarily, but the family needs time before you know, before they might be ready to have these conversations and receive information. So we can be caring for them, right? And helping them prepare and thinking about, yeah, what are we actually going to do to get them any kind of justice, right? I've said so many times, it's so difficult to define justice when someone is taken from you, right? Like, how can we possibly do that? I struggle with it all of the time. And yet that's our responsibility, is to help them define that in their own time and in their own terms, and make sure that, you know, not just weeks but months from now and maybe years from now, that we're still there for them.
I wanted to add before folks get too tired, but one of the things that the city council is going to be pushing for, they talked about it tonight at the meeting, was body cams. And it's not something that we covered tonight, but it is going to be something that our city council in Cambridge votes on. Someone's going to submit a resolution, and that is on the agenda. It is a fix that most of the city council wants to put in place. Even though also a lot of the city council very much acknowledged that would have done nothing here, and unlikely to have done anything here. So as a short primer, so we're not going to really get into it, I'm putting in the chat a pretty good place to start for like an amalgamation of court watch of research on what body cams are. Do they help? What do they do? Cambridge has a real focus on transparency, but not on impact, right? So a lot of the city councilors are framing this, even if body cams don't prevent violence and they don't prevent police misconduct and they don't prevent police killings, they do provide some measure of transparency, as though that is a good goal in and of itself. And that doesn't actually impact change. So it's a good place to start. I'm sure it's something that as community folks will be talking about ongoing, but it's definitely coming. And the city council seems really jazzed about it. So I also have to go, but thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, I think we'll start to wrap up, and I'll maybe take this last question if that's okay. But I'll say, I'll add to what Atara was just saying. Definitely find us on social media if you want to kind of see some of what we're talking about as we go. In fact, I on my own Twitter, asked folks to help me find resources on those sponge grenades that we showed earlier, and how less lethal weapons are used. And we honestly found so many awful things from that. I'm like, I didn't want to know that all of these technologies and weapons existed. But definitely, follow like Muslim Justice League on social media. And from there, you'll see us retweeting Court Watch and all of our partner organizations. And then I saw a question about, outreach and mobilizing folks. So Sunday is really something that was started by Somerville teachers who felt really strongly about, having a vigil at the high school where he went to, and there's going to be so much outreach around that. And what I want to say really is, like, again, I think there's a tendency to want to have rallies and protests immediately, and express our rage and our frustration. And we know that this is going to take so much time, and that if we really want to be doing sort of family first type support and organizing, that means also taking time to do that, right? Slowing down and figuring out what's actually helpful for them right now, and having different kinds of events like this. We wanted to do political education with you all tonight. We want to keep having political education with folks who, asked me, wait, what do I do when the police knock on my door? How do I tell my mom, not to answer, right? If she doesn't speak English, how is she going to know, and how is she going to tell them what to do, right? So there's so many parts of this, and I think the political education is really important. The other thing that's really important that we're thinking about as MJL, and we're going to plan events around this with Heart and our partners, is if we want to prevent this from happening, we know that they don't take care of us, right? So we have to take care of each other. We have to actually tend to our mental health and to each other, right? And support each other. So we want to make sure we are actually having spaces for folks to do that kind of healing, right? To do things that could be helpful to process this, to make sure his friends and family have the space to do that and are receiving the kind of support and uplifting messages that they need. So we're really going to be planning out, a number of things that will happen over time. So go to rallies if you want, go to the protests if you want. I love to yell. You're going to hear me yell at all of them. But I hope that folks are really willing and as committed to engaging in the other conversations and types of work that need to happen around this. And yeah, I think we will definitely be keeping folks posted and giving updates as much as possible on what to do around this. So yeah, I think we can close this out. And I just want to say again, I'm so grateful that so many of you tuned in, or maybe you're watching this later. And again, tune in, check out our social media, or sign up for the email lists, and you'll definitely hear so much more from us on this in the future. But yeah, thank you all for being with us tonight.